With everything that's going on at the moment, there's been lots of talk about international law and lots of queries. So I just want to touch on one particular aspect that might be relevant. And again, all this obviously inspired by all the discussion at the moment, but I just want to speak about the law generally and one particular test, and then you can look at, what's going on at the moment or just generally, and you can see how it might apply. So what's the starting position? It's the difference between what we call regular forces and potential irregular forces. Generally speaking, when it comes to things like the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions, so-called high contracting parties, that is where the government has signed up to the conventions, they're regular forces. They receive the benefits of like the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions and all the protections therein. That was a rather interesting situation with actually the Taliban. The US government wrote to the Taliban and said, as the de facto government of Afghanistan, it's your responsibility to hand over Al-Qaeda, which obviously they didn't. But the upshot of that was, by acknowledging the Taliban as the successor state to the original Afghan government, which had signed the conventions many years ago, they were acknowledging that they were a high contracting party. And so the Taliban did attract all the protection of the Geneva Conventions, as opposed to, say, Al-Qaeda, who were considered to be unlawful combatants. But why is that? What makes them unlawful combatants? Well, there is a test, and it's in the Hague Conventions, it's in the Geneva Conventions, and lots of other aspects of international law. And it recognises that you can have sort of popular uprisings in cases of invasion or occupation. This applies both within your territory and also outside your territory if it's a sort of legitimate defence of your, quotes, homeland or whatever. But the test is thus, it's a four-part test. The first limb is that you must be under the command of a superior who is responsible for their subordinates. So you have to have a regular chain of command. If you're just a bunch of people, a gang of equals who all, sort of act in concert but without any sort of leadership, then you'd fail that limb of the test for a start. So yeah, it has to be a chain of command. You have to carry a fixed symbol or insignia recognisable at a distance, because obviously regular armies have uniforms, but irregular armies might not do so. So the idea is you should be able to identify somebody. Now, that's not to say that people have to sort of stand out in the open and go, hey, look at me, and wave their flag. You can still do all the regular things in war. You can take cover, you could wear camouflage as long as you had the symbol on somewhere, on either you, also all your vehicles, etc., etc. So you can do all these sort of like, regular subterfuge in war, taking cover, camouflaging yourself. But the idea is that if you are spotted, you can be readily distinguished from a non-combatant, because it's what we call, remember we've discussed before about perfidy, which is taking advantage of the laws and customs of war to an unfair advantage, and that would be mingling with the civilian population, so people can't tell, well, hang on, are you a legitimate target or are you a non-combatant, in which case we have to protect you. Similarly, you have to carry arms openly. So now, again, it's not to say you have to wave your rifle around, but what it's to stop is people effectively looking like civilians, getting close to somebody and then pulling a weapon. We've discussed before about this idea of the origin of the phrase, show your true colours. In other words, yes, you can disguise yourself to get into an advantageous position, but before you actually engage in combat, you must show your true colours, you must show your insignia, you must identify yourself so people know that you are like lawful combatants. And the final limb is that you must yourself abide by the laws and customs of war generally under international law. So it's reciprocal. If you don't follow the relevant conventions, the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions, then they don't apply to you. Now, that's not to say it's a free-for-all. Obviously, the general sort of international law and war crimes and things, apply even when you're dealing with unlawful combatants. But what that means is, if you are captured, for instance, you don't have the protections under the Third Geneva Conventions in terms of being a prisoner of war. You have to be looked after, you have to be released as soon as practicable after the hostilities are over. If you're deemed to fail any of those limbs of the test, then you are an unlawful combatant, and general criminal law applies, whether that's domestic law or international law. But yeah, I hope you found that useful. And like I say, you might now, when you're looking at things around the world, go, well, hang on a second, is this effectively a popular uprising and they're abiding by all the rules? Or is this basically unlawful the unlawful combatants, or it's just terrorism, or it's just random gangs wandering around with no sort of coherent leadership? But if you have to abide by all 4 limbs of that test to achieve the protections. So there you go. You'll have your own views on whether certain groups actually do tick all the boxes there, I would well imagine. But anyway, as always, hope you found that vaguely interesting and vaguely useful. If you did, please consider clicking the like button, subscribing, sharing, etc. And if you have any more sort of comments about the specifics of this, feel free to ask in the comments.